And so we're very excited about that. This has not only breathed new life into the downtown with new and exciting businesses, but we also have new residents living downtown that support those businesses. In addition, we've added affordable housing units that has helped us achieve our 10% affordable housing state mandate. And most importantly, Reading does a lot of planning, and involving the community is a key aspect of our planning. Community engagement is part of our process as we continue our efforts to keep downtown vital, preserve what's important, and be queued up for opportunities. Yes, we are changing, but we can do this while preserving the fabric of the community, while working with our community partners and developers, the state, and people who want to locate in Reading because it's such a great place to live and to do business in. We would love to get your feedback on our work. Feel free to contact any of us on the team. There are numerous upcoming public forums and other times when we would be most welcome to hear your feedback. Before I close, I just want to remind everyone that we do have a survey live, and that can be accessed from the town website. Thank you again, and I look forward to the discussion tonight.
Thank you so much, Jean. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you to our developer panelists as well. We're going to be hearing from them shortly about the Reading market and concepts of housing demand, development finance, and zoning. First, my name is Karina Oliver Milchman. I'm Chief of Housing and Neighborhood Development at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and we're working with the town of Reading on this year downtown community engagement process. I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Christian Brandt, in our Community Engagement Division. Christian is sort of emceeing tonight, so thank you, Christian. So just to run through our agenda, we had our welcome from the town. I'm going to give a brief presentation. Then we'll have a nice chunk of time to hear from our developers. I have some questions prepared for them, but we're also going to be taking questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A function to submit questions. So on that note, a couple of tech tips and tricks. This is a webinar rather than a meeting. You all are muted and you don't have any video because it's a webinar. You'll only see the panelists and the facilitator and others who are speaking. You will be able to ask questions, as I mentioned. Please use the Q&A function. It looks like this. You can see it at the bottom right on your screen, kind of middle right, where that arrow is. So as Jean mentioned, the process to adopt the Downtown Smart Growth District began in 2007, and it entailed numerous public meetings. The topic was regularly on the Community Planning and Development Commission's agenda. In 2017, after several public workshops about the DSGD, and at the recommendation of the Select Board and a public hearing, the district was expanded from approximately 26 to 48 acres, and the affordable housing requirement was increased from 20% to 25% only in rental developments of more than 12 units. The DSGD was adopted and expanded for two primary reasons. The first was to increase activity in the downtown and address some of the properties that had become vacant, and generally try to increase activity, rebuild the walkable center that the downtown used to be. And the second was to ensure that development occurs in an appropriate smart growth location while preserving other areas in town for less development or less dense development, and to ensure that development occurs in a way that advances community priorities. And Chapter 40R is a really great tool for that. It's different from, for example, Chapter 40B, which allows higher density development to sort of circumnavigate local zoning. This bakes community priorities into the local zoning to guide the location and type of development. And as Jean mentioned, there's been a lot of success. There's been 5 mixed-use developments. There's 1 multifamily development. The zoning allowed Reading to reach and surpass the 10% state goal on the subsidized housing inventory. And a lot of communities that do reach that goal have trouble staying there. But with the 40R district and the affordable housing requirement, it will be easier for Reading because a certain percentage of affordable housing in the district is required to be deed restricted affordable and therefore eligible for the subsidized housing inventory. And this development has also brought in state funding to the town of Reading through Chapter 40R. So I want to get into how this development actually happened, how it works. And for that, I want to talk about development costs. And seems like the slides are not advancing. Give me a second. All right, so we're all the way over here. Development costs. So I want to point out a couple things. First of all, development is really expensive. And housing in particular is expensive. It can cost $350,000 to $400,000 just to build a one-bedroom unit. And I think this chart indicates well how there's also only so much wiggle room. You can see that the developer fee is just a tiny fraction of the total development costs, while the construction costs are more than half. So the costs are pretty much fixed for the most part. And when you think about what do you want to see on a particular site in terms of development, the zoning is really how you dictate that. So, for example, you might want a site with a mix of elements. Obviously, there's going to be some buildings, maybe it's housing, maybe it's mixed-use development. There might be some parking. You might want some open space, some landscaping. And a developer pays for all of this with a construction loan. Essentially, he or she is taking out a mortgage the same way you might to buy a home. And the loan amount is based on future project income. So how much the project is expected to make to cover the costs. And these different elements have different costs associated with them, different price tags. And they also bring in different amounts of future project income. So development, housing in this case, or mixed use development, has a cost to build, but it also brings in significant project income because there's high demand for housing in the region and it's a high cost market. Parking, on the other hand, it costs something to build. I think it's $25,000 per space for structured parking and $10,000 for surface space, so it's not cheap. And it doesn't, in a market like Reading, it doesn't bring in any project income. Open space, on the other hand, not too expensive. Landscaping is not, a huge cost, but it also doesn't bring in any project income. So I want to play through what this looks like in a couple different scenarios. So in this one, you can see that there's a fair bit of housing, there's a little bit of parking, and there's some open space. And so you got your development costs, and you have your future project income, which is higher than your costs. And that's how you know a development pencils, when the project income is higher than the development costs. But if you look at this scenario, you have less housing, you have quite a lot of parking, and you have a fair bit of open space. And in this case, the future project income is less than the development costs. The project doesn't pencil. So if you required this as a developer through zoning, it wouldn't get built. It's just not financially feasible. Similar in this scenario where you have almost no development, you have quite a lot of open space preserved and a little bit of parking. Just doesn't work. So how do communities proceed? The secret is to ensure that not only is the income greater than the cost, but that communities are aware up front of the need to make certain things priorities, but not everything a priority, because that's just going to dampen development. So for example, if you want parking or open space, you need to allow for more housing because that covers the cost. If you want affordable units, so mixed income development, you might need to provide a density bonus of the market rate units to help cover the costs of the affordable housing. And there are priorities baked into your downtown smart growth zoning from the very beginning. The first one was mixed use development, and the second was affordable housing. And the zoning is written to prioritize those things in order to create starter homes and downsizing opportunities for seniors, to bring in residents, to support local businesses, to ensure the use of the commuter rail, and to foster a vibrant downtown. It also helped Reading contribute to meeting the share of the region's housing needs, and it help foster diversity and create an equitable neighborhood. But these things come with a cost. So ground floor retail and mixed use development, for example, it costs something to build, But there's also a opportunity cost because that ground floor now isn't housing units. There's also a fair bit of risk entailed because while there's endless demand for housing, that's not the case with retail. So if you write your zoning to require too much retail space and it doesn't get leased, you have a vacancy, and there's a huge cost with vacant space in development. So to mitigate that risk, you want to make sure your zoning isn't requiring an excess of retail. A similar idea with affordable housing. It costs the same to build as market rate units, but it brings in less project income because it's rented at below market rates. And the more affordable housing you build, the less project income you bring in because the rents are lower. So again, you have development costs and you have project income, and you need to make sure that the amount of affordability required is offset so that the project is feasible. So I want to introduce our panel now. These people know far more about development than I do, and I'm excited to talk with them. And I'm going to remind everyone that if you aren't already, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions to the panelists. And to start things off, I will ask some questions myself. And to start, I will ask each of the three panelists to introduce themselves. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
I'm Ian Gillespie of Gillespie and Company.
I'm Dave Tregorth, Tregorth Companies, also known as the developer of Ace Flats at Gold Street.
And I'm Matt Zoller of MPZ Development, and we focus on doing smaller unit development, mixed income, mixed use across the Commonwealth.
All right, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? I hope. I'm getting some messages that it's a little spotty. Hopefully you can bear with me. So to start things off, I want to ask the three of you, as developers, how do you decide where to build a project? What interests you in a particular area? Anyone can chime in.
Matt, you want to go?
Sure. Thank you for your overview, Karina. That was excellent and a great summary of how development comes together. When looking at projects, it's all about any type of real estate transaction is location, location, location. So you're always first looking at the right place to develop. And then that's a multi-pronged approach that comes with that. So you have to first find the place, and then you have to make sure the economics work for the project. The community embraces what you are trying to do there. And that comes along with also politics. The local politics have to be in favor of the development. And then, the economics have to work for what you're proposing. So that's how I would position that. You guys can elaborate as you see fit.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really important for the work that we do that really tries to blend public and private finance is a really capable town hall city government that is really putting in place the pieces for their town to be successful. I've tried to work with a lot of very dysfunctional governments. Reading is thankfully not one of them. But that's one of the things that I think Matt's right. It's a long checklist of how to pick a site. But I think in a lot of times that to me is one of the biggest that distinguishes communities like Reading that are around 128 up 93. There's a lot of potential communities to work in. And that's one that always sort of catches my eye pretty quickly is town hall, town meeting, putting in place the pieces to have success. Do they have the vision of what they want? Because a lot of towns you go to, there's just endless amount of fighting, endless amount of back and forth. And, not surprisingly, they're struggling with a lot of things: property tax revenue, property tax increases, not seeing development happen the way they want to see it happen, struggling downtowns, retail vacancy. And that's part of why, Reading doesn't have that, was very clear with its vision in many ways, and what attracted us to Reading and to some other towns that we've worked in. Ian?
Well, thank you, Dave. And Karina, it's a really complicated, as Dave said, the checklist is endless. Starts with product type. You aren't going to do, today the flavor of the month is last mile warehouse. So we aren't going to do last mile warehouse hopefully in downtown Reading. So there's a product question. But Dave's absolutely right. The biggest question is whether or not the community wants you to be there. The pursuit costs for what we do are enormous. And generally speaking, I don't think it's understood how expensive it is for us to propose a project to a community. And when we propose that project, if the community, if there's a, yeah, we want it, and then there's a, no, we don't want it kind of thing, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's expensive to do these things. We try very hard to, at least on my side, we see ourselves as agents of the town. The last thing we want to do is be in opposition of the town. So when we look at the zoning, we say, are we agents of the town's will? Most people don't look at developers that way, but that's how we look at ourselves. We are agents of the town's will. Sometimes that will, as Dave particularly knows, can change in the middle of the game. And that can be very expensive and very painful. So we do look for communities that are consistent in their approach to the developer.
So going back to this idea of product, Ian, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the last mile warehouse. I actually hadn't heard that before, but I'd love to hear you all speak to how you decide what product to put there, to put where. So the need for the idea of demand, how that plays into it, but also the zoning. Ian, maybe you can start.
Well, one of my favorite projects is a project called 300 Baker Avenue in Concord, Massachusetts. And it was a firm called Genrad who had built 400,000 square feet in the 50s and 60s on 75 acres, not far from the rail. So we thought this was a fabulous project. Some of my friends, for an office project. So some of my friends said, well, it's neither 495 nor 128. You can't do that. And I said, well, you're nuts. You don't understand. Since the 1600s, all roads have led to Concord. You can get there from everywhere. So we took this old dog that Concord was very concerned was going to be a white elephant. And we transformed it into an office building that is, even today, after 20 years, 100% occupied. But you have to change the game. Red Auerbach said this. You have to be prepared to change. In the past 10 years, I have not believed in office. I have believed in multifamily. I particularly believed in suburban multifamily. And as it happens, as we stand here today in 2021, suburban multifamily turned out to be the right kind of product. So you're rolling the dice. You hope you get it right. We're not as smart as people sometimes think we are. And certainly I'm not very good at calling the markets. I just try my best. Dave and Matt probably are better at it than I.
I don't know about that.
I think the other thing is there's a demand in the Boston metro area for every type of every type of use, right? Also the flavor of the month. You probably pick up the paper and you read about lab development, labs, right? Everybody's building labs. Everybody wants a lab in there. And I think also one of the things, what product type partially is, I'll be honest, is what we do is multifamily, right? And so we are seeking out the community, the communities that want and need multifamily development. I'm not a lab developer. Some developers do a really good job of developing all types of different stuff in different towns. And I think there's a decent amount of developers out there who are really focused on multifamily urban infill because it is such a need for as long as the eye can see, right? But that means we're also competing against other things that also want land. So, sometimes we find ourselves competing against, office. We find ourselves competing against luxury condominium. We find ourselves competing against, people who just want to keep it as a parking lot. We can find ourselves competing against storage uses. That's another thing that's been a hot commodity is, put storage wherever and however. So I think too, one of the things I would say that attracted us to Reading was there was the 40R district put in place. That was a signal. And, we're in a market in a general area where housing is just a massive need. And so wherever we can find a community that is open and willing to have the conversation, we're there. And
I would add to that, Dave, we're currently working on a project in downtown Bridgewater where we're doing 57 units of mixed income housing. And that was a project where it was an underdeveloped piece of land. It was an old school building, and it had sat vacant since 1996. And the community just didn't know what to do with it. And they tried a number of means to kind of get interest for it. They changed the zoning for artist live workspace. They talked about potential need for condos. But at the end of the day, we proposed on that back in 2017, and we were the only bidder. And we proposed mixed income multifamily, and the community didn't embrace it at first, but after having a dialogue with them for over a year, they saw the need and the value and what could come about as a result of a true public-private partnership there. And the town went so far as to even invest $1.3 million of their CPA resources to make the project happen. Because in Bridgewater, the economics aren't what they are in Reading. So there isn't, to your earlier presentation, there isn't that kind of culmination of costs and income to offset the costs. So they really believed in the project, and then they put their money where their mouth was. And so it's under construction as we speak today. So it is about the community embracing the use. And if there's no there, you can create one sometimes. But I think Reading is in a different position where they've seen a lot of development as of late. And there's some force there behind it. So they need to decide how best to proceed going forward. So I wanted to add that to the conversation.
Thank you. So I do want to go back to the idea of the economics of development. So you have your zoning, it dictates sort of which developer might have a competitive edge by determining what the land use is, right? So the land use is multifamily, the Daves, the Matts, the Ians might have an edge there against your lab developer. But how do you determine if you are going to do multifamily or mixed income or mixed use on a site, how to divvy up the land among, the building, the open space, the parking? If you could go back to that idea, because I think you'll articulate it better than I, and kind of the role that zoning plays in making that decision versus the role that the economics of development plays.
I mean, I think one of the most important things is we want to create a nice place to live, right? But we also recognize that we are not the only component in a nice place to live, right? So every site is different. Do we need to focus on parking? Do we need to focus on retail? Do we need to focus on providing a little bit of a pocket park? All those types of things, I think overall, at the end of the day, we want people to live in the homes we're building and really love living there. Because if they don't, then it's, a complete failure. And so we look at sort of the wider network of like what's already here and what are the gaps that we can fill. And part of that, for communities that really do their planning well, and I would say Reading is certainly one of them, part of that is really known and really expanded upon and talked about a lot. Sometimes it's not in other communities and you have to dig a little deeper. But that's, I think, ultimately the end goal for everybody, right? And I think that's what the town wants too, right? And hopefully that's reflected in the zoning. A lot of times a project precipitates, some changes, which I think is the right thing. But that's the end goal for all of us.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, when looking at projects and the zoning and what's able to be built, you try to please everybody in that conversation because that's how you get to moving these projects forward is overall consensus of all folks. Not everybody's always going to be happy, but it's nice when everybody can have a say. And so if you have good zoning in place, you can present a project that meets, all of the needs of the community. And then the economics of the project do dictate what you can and cannot do. So, that's when you start to push and pull levers and say, we can do a little bit less green space if we do more parking, or we could do more residential units, if we do a little bit less parking. So they all work together to kind of create this symbiotic relationship of what becomes the ultimate development plan. And I do have to say that a lot of this all does come back to the economics, because if the project isn't financeable, then you can't build it. And so that is really crucial, and why such things like 40R are a great tool, because you can create a project where you normally wouldn't create one because the underlying zoning doesn't allow it. But then you have to be able to finance it. So it's not a slam dunk just having the zoning in place. You have to have consensus of the community and then have a project that's ultimately financeable.
And the financing, Matt, if you could elaborate a little. So that's the construction loan that I spoke about during the presentation, or are there multiple financing sources that you're pursuing? How does that work?
Yeah, so in a traditional market rate project, and Ian and Dave might speak to this to a greater degree, I do a lot of mixed income housing, which there's some subsidy resources in play when you do those types of projects. But traditional development is created by two factors: equity and debt. And so equity looks for a return. Debt is raised by a function of what the income of the project could be. And so those are really the construction loan is utilized during the construction to bridge the equity and the debt. So it's another piece of the puzzle, but you can't create a project unless you have the revenues to justify the investment of the equity and the long-term supporting of the debt. Those are in simple terms what kind of creates the financing for a traditional real estate development project, a market rate project.
Just a quick reminder to folks, we have 2 good questions in the Q&A so far. Please use the Q&A to add additional questions for the panelists. At some point, I'll probably run out of questions. And there's no need to raise your hand because we're just using the Q&A function. Dave or Ian, do you have anything to add to either of the last 2 questions?
No, I don't think so. There's a cost-benefit ratio that factors into the equity. and again, the pursuit costs, if you're familiar with that term, you have pursuit costs are generally, they may have different experiences, but are almost all equity. Unfortunately, they almost all come out of your own pocket or pockets of your partners. And a simple project starts with probably, I don't know, $150,000, $250,000 worth of pursuit costs, a substantive project, and substantive could be 36 units. We spent probably $500,000 doing 36 units in pursuit costs. So that piece of the financing puzzle is arguably the trickiest. And that's why, in my case, the first thing I do in a community is go and talk to the community, the planning board, to the extent they'll talk to us, the planner and so forth, select board, and find out what they want, because it's just really terrible when you get in and find out that it isn't what they want. Or what we find often is that there's one faction that does want it and one faction that doesn't, and we're caught in the middle of warfare within the town.
Yeah, I echo what Ian's saying here in terms of pre-development costs. That's what I call them. And making that decision to make the initial investment is a challenge. If there isn't a community that is willing and ready to embrace the development project, it can make or break a small company like mine. If you go into a community and you don't have consensus, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars that you spent to kind of get into a process, and it's hard. But it's not something that we don't do on a regular basis. That's why we're in this business. We understand the importance of doing these types of projects, and that initial investment is an opportunity cost. But at the same time, again, we don't want to go into communities where development isn't something that they want to embrace.
So to get back to zoning and segue a bit, in your experience, all three of you, if the zoning is in place, does that usually indicate that a community is embracing whatever they've zoned for and it's smooth sailing? How do those pieces come together?
I'll take that one. Only because, not in Reading, I've had a recent experience where communities worked for 3-4 years intensely, a decade prior to planning and executing a plan for a property in a municipal disposition, and got through town meeting, went through multiple town meetings, and then sort of when the rubber hit the road, 450 people got signatures and referendumed the town meeting vote. And so I think there's, in Massachusetts especially, there's, the expectation that there's probably always going to be bumps in the road. But I think that, there's a risk to that for towns, right? To pull a head fake, because developers talk to each other, developers read the paper. And that's certainly something that people are looking at as they're thinking about whether to invest in a community or not. Does it not only, have a vision, but does it have some consistency and some predictability, right? People always say in business, you just want predictability. Well, this business is no different, right? So I think, it's a signal, right? Zoning is a signal. If it meant, that it was going to happen, then a lot more people would probably be developers. and MAPC probably wouldn't be around. but there's a lot of challenges that come after zoning, and there's a lot of work that comes after zoning to make success. I mean, and that's what's been so remarkable about Reading, is that putting in place the 40R district, as long as it took, and as much thought as it took, there was a ton of work after that. And the CPDC, I think, can attest to that. The amount of input and the amount of diligence that goes into each one of these is incredible, as it should be. And I think it makes the projects better. I think that process does make the projects better when it works right. I think for Ace Flats, it made it better, no doubt about it. So, Ian, Matt.
I've done both 40R and 40B. I've done special permit work, and I've done as of right zoning work. I've also done Boston projects, which is its own zoning animal. As Dave said, it's the beginning of the conversation. But in the places where I have done 40R, it's always been a process that's been well thought out in terms of the sequential steps that play into what people have as a vision in their downtown smart growth overlay district. They think about density and uses, but also design guidelines, which are key to have a really cohesive and functional downtown. I did a large 40R project in Brockton, which is very different than Reading. It's a community that's coming back from what was once a very industrial nature, and trying to create a sense of place with housing and commercial residential uses, retail uses. It sounds like, from what I understand in Reading, and I have not been there and I have not developed there, but it sounds like the 40R district is doing what it was intended to do, which is create a cohesive framework for development and a vibrancy to the downtown, an increased density, and an increased use change, so to speak. So it sounds like the tools are in place, just needs to evolve. Like anything, things evolve as they move forward, and if they don't, then they go away. So I do think it is a robust tool, that being zoning overall. But again, it's the start of the conversation.
I want to ask one more question, and then we'll start taking questions from the audience, and we'll sort of go back and forth. But the question I'd like to follow up with right now is, have you ever worked in a community where there was a planning process to establish a vision? There was a clear vision. Let's say it's a walkable, vibrant, activity-oriented downtown with lots of diverse housing opportunities. But the zoning didn't facilitate that kind of development. And if so, what were kind of the aspects of the zoning that were posing barriers to accomplishing that vision?
I think one of the ones that we struggle with all the time is parking. In terms of zoning requirements that are antiquated, that just haven't been changed because of inertia, and people's feeling about what is needed and what's appropriate. I think that's one of the biggest ones that is an unknown cost to that people don't realize. Like, I've been in situations where I've been sitting down and I'm like, if we can cut the parking in half, or we can provide all these additional, we can make the building footprint smaller, we could provide more open space, we could provide more affordable units. And I think one of the things that's important to note is I don't want to build a building with inadequate parking, right? Because if I do, then I'm not going to have people who are happy to live there, right? So I think there needs to be, that's one of the biggest impediments from my perspective, to high quality design. is sort of this very rigid, every building provides every, parking space that's required. I work a lot in Haverhill, where a beautiful historic downtown and all those buildings have no room for parking, right? And so if you want those buildings to be rehabbed, right? And you do need parking, you need some parking, right? If you want those buildings to be rehabbed, where do you put the parking? And it was a problem that was created by the fact that Haverhill went into a very long and deep decline. And so all the upper stories of those historic buildings were not fixed up forever and ever. They weren't knocked down. It was not economic to even knock them down. And all of a sudden, 6-7 years ago, we come along and we start looking at these buildings. And the first question was, we'd love to have you, nice downtown, good infrastructure, parking problem. Where are you going to park the cars? Well, there we rent spaces in the municipal garage. And all of a sudden, and we and others, all of a sudden you see these this beautiful downtown walkable, got open spaces, pocket parks, murals. If you haven't been to downtown Haverhill in a while, go there, go visit a restaurant. And that's all happened because they were able to figure out how to solve that parking problem in a creative way. That all of a sudden allowed us to invest in really affordable retail on the ground floor, so we can get the small local business in at a very, very low cost, and get the pocket parks and get the public art and all those different types of things. And for me, zoning, that's one of the biggest things that's still stuck way in the past. And luckily 40R allows you some of the flexibility around that. We had a lot of conversations around 40R and Ace Flats. But still, we have 69 spaces for 55 units. And had we been able to, I think the building footprint would have been smaller. Had we been able to figure out some other options for parking.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts on that before we move on? All right, well, we have some really great questions from attendees. I want to encourage folks to continue dropping your questions in the Q&A. To start, I think this will be a good segue. We have a question: what do you think the market is like for ground floor uses in downtown Reading that aren't retail, but can nonetheless activate and contribute to vibrancy? So like a co-working space or an incubator space.
Can I just start with something that's not Reading specific, and then maybe Dave could speak to specifics because he's on the ground there.
Yes, please.
I will say that in doing mixed use projects, that ground floor retail is probably one of the hardest elements to attack as it relates to tenancy and figuring out what the right ratio of space is for a particular building. What I've seen is that, I do a lot of work in the gateway cities. And I see that there's a lot of vacant storefronts, and that's because neighborhood retail is one of these things that, I give credit to the mom and pops that start businesses and occupy those spaces, because it's really challenging to start your own business and then maintain it. And, operating those businesses is one thing, but then, paying rent is another. And so it's hard to find the right tenancies in various communities. That said, I have had great experience in finding some really good retailers to occupy those spaces. And it's always about the relationship and that business or that group wanting to be in that location for reasons that aren't economic sometimes. So it's just important to note that it's very challenging to do these mixed use type projects. And some real thought needs to be given to, what businesses go into these buildings and how many spaces we create and what types of spaces can be created. And I think that speaks to the question is, what else can be put in these ground floor retail opportunities. So Dave, maybe you can speak about your experience.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very bullish about Reading retail. I know that wasn't, first of all, there's some awesome questions, which is part part of what I love working in Reading is there's a lot of people who are really invested in the town and interested. And I think these questions reflect that, and know a lot. You know, I think retail in Reading is going to do great. I think, which is a lot of communities can't say, as Matt just said. um, and I think the alternative uses for, you know, usually communities where retail is really struggling is they're reaching out to find those alternative uses, you know, office space or co-working or incubator or anything that sort of gets it going. I think the good news is in Reading is, you know, yeah, that would be nice to have too, but you've also got a lot of other potential uses on the ground floor that will drive pedestrian activity and other things. I co-working has always been really hard, and I think, you know, as the post-COVID world evolves and more people are working from home, but also then like I gotta get out of the house and go do, you know, we're still trying to figure that out, to be honest, in communities like Reading. I think that there is probably a real opportunity for, you know, sort of street front co-working in suburban downtowns like Reading. Somebody's probably going to do it soon. But there's also, you know, the other side of that for Reading is there's a good demand for retail in Reading. So, you know, that co-working might get priced out. Hard to tell. But I see a lot of promise generally.
Yeah, we've seen this from a lot of communities where they ask us to do retail on the ground floor, and you know, and there's a certain logic to it. There's already retail on the ground floor of a lot of the other buildings. The problem often in these suburban towns is that the retail isn't doing that well. So the argument we have made from time to time is, don't make me poach the limited number of retail tenants that are there to my project. I don't want to be poaching. In Winchester, the master plan assumed that we would do retail on the ground floor. And as we went through the process with the planning board on one building, they said, why bother? What about doing residential? So we are doing what's referred to in the trade as townhouses with stacked flats above, so that we actually have more of a, at least in proposed, more of like a Newbury Street feel, where there's a residential mixed in. And that seems to be meeting the demands that they have for more housing in the downtown. And their retail, surprisingly, is not all that strong.
So I'm going to combine two questions now because I think they sort of go together. One is, what's the greatest pro and the most challenging con to working with Reading in the 40R district? And I'm going to throw in there also, when you do find a comfortable community to work with, like some of you spoke of Reading, do you tend to stick around and look for other opportunities to do additional work, additional projects? So Dave, maybe you want to start that out since you're been active recently.
I'll just answer the pro and the second question. No, I think, do we stick around? It's a real thing that I'm proud of, that I have towns, you know, where we've developed, and mayors and town managers and planners call me and say, please, can you go look at that property? Or can you, so the answer is yes, we usually end up sticking around because you learn the people, the faces, the names, the habits, the committees, and a lot of times become friends with them. And that's what you hope for, because if you're not having fun, then what's the point, I think, from my perspective, and meeting people and challenging yourself. And so yes, we hope to stay around. because learning about a community is fun, but it's also in Massachusetts, because there are so many communities, it's a value, right? And something honestly that we share with other people who are trying to do work in the community of, we do talk to each other and we say, yeah, this town knows what they're doing, or that town, and here are the pros and here are the cons, because I think a lot of developers, you think of like, cutthroat, I'm going after this. It's, there's so much work that needs to be done. So many things, so many parcels, so many towns that, and I think a lot of people are genuinely interested in, earning a living, but also changing a place for the better. And so we hope to stick around. The first one was, what's the pro of working in the 40R? I mean, I think generally, I think I've sort of said this before, I think Reading, town and the residents are really smart, and they get it, and they're good to work with, and the 40R to me was almost just an invitation to come be a part of the community, right? When it was passed, it was like, oh, okay, this is what this community's worked really long on hard time, long time to figure out. And, they want something that I do, right? And that's been the pro, is just, that there's the tools in place. And I had done 40R projects in other communities with a lot of success. And, the tools were, it was there. The con, I think, I'll be sort of, one of the cons about 40R generally is that there is so much up for discussion as part of the permitting process. It's what are the details of the windows, and what is the, this specific, which, as I said before, and I absolutely believe, makes a better project. It also makes a more expensive project. I think thankfully a lot of people have really appreciated some of the historic elements that we've been able to build into Ace Flats, the facade. We worked a long time with a lot of neighbors and the CPDC to come to that through multiple meetings. That came at a really big expense as compared to your normal, typical box multifamily development. I think at the end of the day, we got a much better thing on the street, but it comes at an expense, and it comes at time and pursuit costs, as Ian said, to figure that out and to go through that conversation. And from a just purely financial developer perspective, that's a con in the sense that it costs more, right? And it takes more time.
But not just from the developer's perspective, right? Could one of you speak to how are those costs absorbed? Are they passed on through the cost of the market rate units? How does it affect the cost? How does it affect the opportunity to include affordable units? One of the questions we have here is whether developers receive funding from the state to cover the cost for the affordable units in a mixed income property. So is there a relationship there?
Yeah, I think to your point, and in the presentation, everything that comes with a cost, right, has to be offset by some type of revenue, right? Whether it's a belief in higher rents, whether it's a, parking revenue, whether it's whatever. To be honest, to answer the question about public funding, not all these 40R projects come with public funding. We went out and sought public funding for the affordable units, because otherwise the project wasn't gonna fly, with the 25% affordable requirement, plus a beautiful facade, plus the other community mitigation. It just wasn't going to pencil out unless we got that public funding. Some projects,
and that's competitive, right, Dave?
Yeah, it's competitive and it takes time to get, and it's a risk. Some projects can fly on their own without that. But if you start layering on affordability, to the point of, okay, we want affordable, we want it shorter, we want it, then that either the project doesn't happen or in the case of Bridgewater, I think Matt said, they put in their own money as a town to say, okay, we really want this. It doesn't pencil. And I think a lot of developers like us, and, we're very transparent with the numbers, is say, okay, well, this costs this and that costs that. And,
I think, yeah, just to add to what you're saying, Dave, which I completely agree with, is, there's a lot of requests as you go down the road of development. We try and make everybody happy, right? And so, but everything comes at a cost. And so there are ways to kind of figure out how to offset those costs. And one of them is chasing some subsidies in cases. And some developers are willing to do that and others are not. And so, but everything has to be kind of run through the process, and you have to choose what you do or do not want. Where we were working in Boston, in Jamaica Plain on permitting a project, that community neighborhood wanted us to reduce this overall size of the building. And, we were able to figure out how to take off a few units to set back the building to make it more, at that facade in line with what the neighborhood triple decker, look and feel was. And so, but that came at a cost. And then when there were other requests, we couldn't meet those requests because we lost unit count. So it's a very tricky balance, I think, is the moral of the story.
Okay, next question. I really like this one. So this person says that they're generally a fan of mixed-use suburban multifamily housing, but one of their concerns is that the architecture tends to be virtually the same across buildings and across the country. And they're wondering, is that because of the cost associated with doing more facade differentiation and variation or ornamentation, or is there something towns can do to diversify the building styles in the architecture?
I'm going to take that one for just a brief moment. What we do is more akin to a stage set than anything else. The functioning parts of the building, office buildings completely, but I can do an office building in my sleep. But the functioning parts of multifamily, the way people live, the way the kitchen, bedrooms, and so forth are laid out, there is a sort of an accepted rhythm to the way these things work for the way people live. And so the buildings can't be, for example, too deep, or the apartments, the units can't be too deep and so forth. So there has to be a rhythm to that. But then the facade can be anything you want it to be. And sometimes I think people don't realize that it's the facade is a stage set. So we can make it look any way you want it to, except that what's behind the set, it has to be functional. And so the window rhythm and the way the Juliet balconies work and so forth, where the entrance is, where the emergency stairs are and so forth, that's prescribed. And we have to sort of follow that prescription. But then we can do whatever you want with the front.
Well, and I will just, if you said build the most economical multifamily building that you can, it would be 60 feet wide, probably about 100 to 120 feet long. And it would be slab on grade, residential on the ground floor, moving on up. And it would be clapboard, what we call hardy panel siding.
3 stories.
3 stories, maybe 4. And that would be the least cost to build. Everything you do that deviates from that very simple rhythm, as Ian says, and way that wants to be, adds cost. And all those things we do to change it are good things for the public realm, good things for design and longevity and all those types of things. But that's part of the reason why you see that building out there so frequently. If you look at a 40B development, you can kind of drive by and you're like, that's a 40B development. That's a 40B development, right? Clapboard siding. So it is, I'll tell you the Ace Flats facade is far more expensive than we would put on something that didn't go through a 40R process. And it looks great. It's brick. It's not what you see every day on a multifamily in a suburban community. But that's part of what you get with 40R. That's really good from a community perspective, is that oversight and that review, the ability to review it.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful facade. Okay, I'm going to pair two more questions together just because we have a little over 10 minutes left. So these are both, one of them is framed specific to Reading, but I think it'd be interesting to hear about broader development in the broader area. So the first is, what, in your experience, is the ideal size for successful retail space for mixed-use development on the ground floor? And the second is phrased as, what's wrong with the Reading parking formula? But also, what formula is best, regardless of maximizing profit and land value?
I can take the retail space question in my experience, what I've seen. I think roughly anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 square feet for a neighborhood retail shop is sufficient. You end up with kind of larger spaces than that, given the rhythm that Ian spoke to when you're trying to not do residential on the ground floor. That's what I've seen. Restaurants are a little bit bigger. They're probably about 3,000 to 3,500 square feet. And some are much larger than that, but those are typically the numbers that I see. I don't know if Dave wants to comment, or Ian, on that, those sizes.
Yeah, I think, we've found for small local businesses like 1,500 square feet, they can make all kinds of things work in that amount of space. And, the small local businesses that are starting out really want to have, it built out. So there's a low capital cost to get in. They want to have it compact. And we've had a lot of success. So, and maybe sometimes you get lucky and you get somebody that'll take the whole space that's available, but often you'll see it, here's 1,500 square feet. Here's, in Haverhill, we have a 500 square foot spot. Art gallery loves it because it's affordable. You see it get divided up pretty quickly. Karina, what was the other question?
The other question was about what's the best parking formula, not about maximizing profits. So just, I think best is defined differently. Probably having demand for parking.
Yeah, Ian, what are you seeing where you're working?
Well, one of the things in Winchester, of course, Winchester is a train station. So actually there are two in Winchester, but downtown Winchester is a train station. So we have a different parking ratio available to us in downtown because of our proximity. But parking, I don't know if people are aware, but generally speaking, parking wags the dog of the development. So it's, and I would suggest forgive me, your cost may be a little out of date. I would say a structured parking space is, $50,000 to $70,000. We will do some in Winchester that are probably closer. It's a so-called bathtub. because it's in the water table. So it'll be closer to, $75,000 or $80,000 of space. So we're going to do an automated parking garage in that case, which is another element of the new world, is the automated robotic parking. You can put a lot more parking in the same place. Just an anecdote for that. One of the questions that comes up is what happens when people aren't driving anymore, or they have, some other way of getting around? What are you going to do with that automated space? And one of the answers is that you'll put a self-storage unit where the car was. So that the owner of the unit will put a self-storage space in there and the robotic won't take it around. So that's one of the things for the future. But parking does wag the dog. And I'm not sure there's a clear answer yet. In Boston, they have buildings where you don't have any parking. So I think it's a huge gradient of opportunities.
Yeah, I agree that your costs are more accurate in terms of the high cost of parking. Stackers and automated parking is the way of the future, and I think it's going to help us kind of get more efficiency out of the parking that we do in new construction going forward. Having done a lot of work in the Boston market, I was excited to get down to half a space per unit, as kind of the need in a very dense urban area. In some cases, no parking. And then as I started my own company several years ago and I'm doing more suburban projects, I'm seeing the need for parking increase exponentially. And that makes sense, a space and a half per unit, 2 spaces per unit, because people need to drive to get to various goods and services, get to work, see their friends. They have visitors, that's so the suburban parking scenario versus the urban parking scenario are very different animals. So I think that plays into it. And then as it relates to, in residential, leasability is what we're all really focused on. People want parking. They want to have a car in a lot of cases. So a condominium building, for example, you're required to do 1 space per unit, or more in some cases. So.
And I just want to real quickly say I'm really sorry that I have to go, because this is a great conversation. I hope it continues, and hopefully, if anybody's listening and wants to be in touch, the town has my contact information. Karina, I would be happy to talk to anybody, listening tonight about, further experiences, thoughts as, Reading considers, 40R and the future. So I want to thank you guys, and apologies, I got to go to another community meeting.
Thank you, Dave. Good luck at your community meeting. We're going to take 2 more questions from Matt and Ian. And we unfortunately won't be able to get to all of the great questions we had tonight, but we will try to get to 2 more before we wrap up, so I hope people will stick around. The first is a question about 40R. This attendee thinks that the zoning puts upward pressure on land prices because developers are, quote, forced to build bigger and more expensive projects to compete for the land. So they want to know that if a project is smaller scale, would land prices simply adjust downward to accommodate that, to make that possible?
Go ahead, Ian, if you have thoughts on this. You're on mute. I'll take it as far as I can. So there's a lot of parts and pieces to that question, so I'll try and get to the ones that I heard. So, land values are a function of the market to some degree. And so if there's demand, land prices will increase. And so if a 40R district is successful and developers want to develop there, then land prices will increase. doing a smaller project won't necessarily facilitate a lower land cost, has been my experience. So that's how I would answer that question. I don't know if there's more to it.
Well, what we have done sometimes, and it's not specifically 40R, is that we will make an arrangement with the property owner that if we get less than we expect, we pay less, and if we get more, then we pay more, so that they are part of the process. Sometimes owners don't fully understand that when they go under agreement with a terrible person like us, that they are in a partnership. Almost by definition. We are a partner. We have two partners. We have the property owner and we have the town. We always consider the town and the city our partner. Again, it goes back to we are executing the will of the community. To the extent that it's known, and I have to emphasize that because one of the things we run into often, in one community, they had relatively new zoning, and we were before the planning board, and the planning board, one of the planning board members, very influential, said, well, I don't like your project and I don't like the zoning. So it wasn't, what are we supposed to do? There is an inconsistency there, but at any rate, so we are partners with the town, first and foremost. We're executing their will. And we incorporate the property owner to the extent we can in that process with us.
And since Dave's not here, I'll chime in as a third perspective. I'm not a developer, obviously, but I do work with 101 cities and towns. And in my experience, as well as based on a lot of literature and research, the land cost is first and foremost determined by demand. And the demand for housing in the greater Boston region is incredibly strong. We have one of the most expensive housing markets in the country. And that's because there's so much demand and there's limited supply. And we work with a lot of communities that do zone for low density, small scale development, and their land prices are still incredibly high, in some cases, in hot markets where there's lots of demand, like, for example, Sherburne, or Concord, Lexington, I could go on. So it's not necessarily a function of driving up land costs because of where the density and the height is set through the zoning. And then the last question that I want to,
Karina, not to interrupt you, but you have to temper that with the zoning. For instance, you mentioned Concord. Within Concord, you have in downtown Concord, or relatively downtown Concord, you have industrial zoning, you have office zoning, you have residential. So it's a cost related to the use of that particular zoning.
Yes, absolutely. But in terms of housing, there are a lot of communities where they zone for very low density for single family housing predominantly. And those single family homes are really, really expensive.
Very expensive, right.
Okay, so I'm going to squeeze in one question. I know we're almost out of time. This person is asking about, let's read this. They want to make it clear that there are critics of Reading's 40R zoning, but that those critics generally do support high density TOD. But that they're asking for changes that they see elsewhere, like small setbacks, green spaces, walkways, public areas. And they want to know how other communities in 40R districts have achieved that, and how it could be achieved in Reading through zoning changes. And so I'll tee it off by just asking, is that possible? Do the economics of that kind of development work? Because in most of the 40Rs where I've worked, that's not the case.
So the tool in 40R is the design guideline, and that sets the baseline as to how much open space, lot coverage you can have, parking, etc. And to your point, Karina, I think it all comes back down to the economics of the deal. And so, you know, if you have to create more things that are not revenue generating, it will make the development, it will make or break the development. So that does ring true. And so if communities want to see, you know, more open space, more parking, setbacks, you know, step backs, they, you know, need to figure out, you know, which of those things they really want to see, and then make that choice. You know, there's also a benefit to the community that where there are incentive payments for 40R districts. And so, you know, maybe there's an opportunity to put those back into the project sometimes. And I know that's difficult and can be difficult because it's very hard to run a city or town in the Commonwealth. So that's what I would say with that, about that. Ian, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I think what we ask is that the town tell us what they want up front. And then it goes into the package. So then that goes to the land value that you're paying for. So I think, Karina, your question was really sort of after the fact. You've paid X for the land and now you're required to do these things. If the town tells you going in what you're supposed to do, we play by the rules. So we really, again, we're partnered with the community. We ask them, the hardest thing for a developer is to get clarity about what the community wants. But if we, I mean, it's a great gift if we know up front that we have X setbacks and so forth, sidewalks and whatever it is, retail, whatever it is that the community wants. If we know that going in, then we can account for it. What happens is we get trapped. We're in there for a couple $100,000, and then there are conflicting opinions within the community, and that's where we get caught. And that's very difficult for us.
Great, thank you. So I think that was a good question to end on, actually. Julie will talk more about this, but we are having an event coming up where we're going to talk about zoning more specifically for the Downtown Smart Growth District and how zoning can be used to advance different community priorities, including some of the ones that this attendee suggested in their question. So before I hand it over to Julie for closing remarks, I do just want to thank our panelists so much for their time tonight. Dave, Matt, and Ian, you fielded some tough questions and I think provided some really great insights, and we really appreciate you being here and speaking to these challenges. And I want to thank all of the attendees who made it out tonight. I think we had 46 at our peak, which is a really good sized webinar, particularly on a Tuesday evening. So we appreciate all of your time and also your really thoughtful questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie for closing remarks.
Hi, thank you, Karina. I want to echo those comments and those thank yous to everybody for joining us tonight, especially on a night that comes during a town meeting week. I know this is another late night out for people, not as late as the others though. So I did just want to say also thank you to the panelists and thank you to everyone for the great questions that we got. And I learned a lot myself tonight, so this is super helpful. And we do have some upcoming opportunities for additional input, additional education, additional feedback, and some actions the CPDC will be taking in the next couple of months that I just want to highlight for everybody. So first of all, I want to plug the survey. We have a Your Downtown survey that went out to all households in Reading, including rental households, with a QR code and a link. On that postcard, there was also a link to a survey from our Parking Advisory and Recommendations Committee. So if you haven't seen that postcard or taken that survey, please, by all means, get right on it in your spare time. That'd be really helpful to us. And then coming up at November subsequent town meeting, which starts on November 8th, the CPDC will be giving an update on this 40R bylaw process and the Your Downtown, as we're calling this effort, process. There will be a preview of that printed in the town meeting warrant report that you'll get at your homes. So please read through that and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And then coming up in December, December 1st, we have another community event facilitated by MAPC. It's about how zoning tools can help advance a vision. And that'll be another format like this. It'll be a Zoom meeting, maybe webinar format, maybe just a public Zoom. We're still working out those details. So again, that's December 1st, and it will be in the evening. And then on December 6th, the Community Planning and Development Commission will open their public hearing for any 40R zoning amendments that are going to be proposed for April 2022 town meeting. So staff are working on incorporating all the feedback that we've been getting over the past many months into something that the CPDC can digest and start to talk about. So please attend that meeting. That will be a hybrid meeting, select board meeting room, and also available over Zoom. So stay tuned for that. And I think that's actually all that we have coming up in the next couple months. Hope I didn't forget anything, but yeah, feel free to reach out to me if you think of any follow-up questions tonight, and we can try to help facilitate more of this discussion as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a really great night. We'll talk to you next time.